Welcome to the Crisis Management webinar presented by the Rani Irani Center for Energy Solutions at the University of Oklahoma. My name is David Ferris, and I am the Executive Director of the Irani Center. Thank you for attending this session, which is literally spanning the globe with attendees from many different countries. This diversity of interest shows the global nature of addressing this pandemic, and we hope our session today will provide a framework for you and your organizations. We're blessed to have Dr. Jorge Rodriguez-Grau as our guest lecturer this morning. He has over 20 years of experience in the health, safety, and environmental industry with particular focus on oil and natural gas industry, as well as ecological risk assessment. He is currently the managing director at Ics Technologies, which is a consulting firm based out of Houston. You can expect to hear Jorge lead us through how we are using an incident command system to provide operational support during the COVID pandemic that we are all dealing with. This section of the webinar should last around 45 to 50 minutes and will be followed by Jorge addressing your questions. As questions come up for you, please type them in the chat box during the presentation, and we'll do our best to address each question within our allotted time frame. Thank you again for your time and engagement in our webinar. I'll now turn the presentation over to Jorge.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ferris, for your introduction. And I thank you all for kindly accepting our invitation to this webinar. Let us get started by reviewing the table of contents that we have prepared for you all today. We will begin by giving you an overview of a simplified version of a business cycle and how an emergency response fits into it. Next, we will explain some basic notions of incident command system, or also called ICS. From there, we will dig into the emergency response cycle and how its planning takes place. And then we'll give a broader perspective on the ICS structure and functions. And finally, we'll enter our discussion about pandemic scenarios, including, of course, COVID-19, and how an ICS approach can help at facilitating our crisis management. I will end up this webinar with some highlights on everything that we'll be discussing this morning, and also perhaps highlighting other things that might have not been explained during these contents as well. So let us, following our agenda, let us get a simplified overview of a business cycle, which is what I have here on this screen, where there is a business plan with its corresponding portfolio. It's called an initial portfolio, which is generally risk assessed and yielding a revised version which contains the corresponding projects that are going to be executed through this cycle. The execution takes place, and as we do so, it is very desirable to have some means of verifying or auditing each one of those projects in which we'll be able to capture corrective actions, which of course fits on this business cycle. The idea is for this business cycle is to move over and over again, repeat itself with no interruptions, continuously providing improvements, of course yielding profits. However, we all know that there are unexpected incidents or events that can happen. And when that happens, we risk assess the situation again, and we could very well activate the emergency response that is aligned with our dealings of our companies. That emergency response, however, is actually a part of a broader strategy, usually containing a business continuity plan. And with this approach, we aim at reducing the impact of those unwanted events, enabling the organization to return to its usual stage of business as usual in this business cycle. As a final remark, I have problems with, okay. As a final remark, those corrective actions can also yield new ideas and new projects which fits on the business plan. And again, as I said before, ideally, we want this business cycle never to stop. And we're going to be centering our conversation about this emergency response strategy that, and specifically explaining how that works in when, or how we could use that emergency response to attend situations like we're living today on the case of COVID-19. When we talk about an emergency response, or the so-called Incident Command System, or ICS, is the most widely recognized emergency response in the world, practically. It was developed after the 2001 September 11 terrorist attack in the United States, and as a response to amend the difficulties emergency responders had at the beginning, at being able to interconnect between different agencies. Eventually, this concept of ICS got out of the realms of government agencies and enriched the private sector, and has been implemented successfully ever since. Amongst the multiple benefits we could discuss herein, ICS provides a standardized organizational structure and function to the emergency response, with the benefit of it being tremendously flexible. It can shrink or expand as needed, and also the possibilities of interconnecting with other similar structures. Before we dig into this idea of a structural flexibility, let's get an understanding of how that emergency planning takes place by understanding what is usually called the P cycle, showing 5 different stages of this emergency cycle. Phase 1 refers to understanding and assessing the situation or scenario. This also is where the initial notification takes place, and I will give some hints on how to handle this first verbal notification. Phase 2 takes us into establishing the incident objectives, and it's in its broadest form. We could define very important and basic general objectives, for instance, as they could be protecting people, protecting the environment, and protecting our assets. On phase 3, we enter a tactical level of developing the plan. On phase 4, or phase 4 refers to preparing and letting everyone know how the plan will be executed. And finally, we get into phase 5, which is the actual execution. This is where the emergency response is completely executed until we have control of the situation, and eventually the structure is demobilized. I said I wanted to talk about a little bit, or give you some hints or recommendations related to the initial verbal notification. What you have here is essentially a one-line single communication, where the person who reports the incident communicates to a person A, that person A communicates to B, C, and so on, until it reaches the decision maker, or the final decision to activate the response. In my view, and in my opinion, having a one-line communication is not advisable, because it can lead to flaws. For instance, you can have person B sleeping in the middle of the night. Usually, unfortunately, as you know, incidents do occur at the worst time of the day or the night. Person C could have his or her cell phone disconnected. So it is not a good idea to have a single line of communications, and the best recommendation I can give is to make sure there is redundancy. in the system. So no good to have that one line single communication. And I'm going to give you a theoretical example of how that double line could be designed. You have the person that communicates, that receives or is at the site of the incident and communicates through two different lines of communication. One could be HSE, Health, Safety, and Environment line, and the other one could be the operations line. And again, the sequence is, as you see here, from person to person and until it reaches again that level of decision making to activate the structure. These again diminishes problems of miscommunications, and so it's highly recommended to keep that concept of redundancy. A variation of what I just said could also be done by this person calling a hotline. And in the United States, there are outstanding services related to hotline 24/7. They receive the phone call, they follow the protocol that the company has decided and activates both lines of communications until the final decision is made to activate the emergency response. I'm going to give you, this is very theoretical, so I like to give you a real example. This is a lines of communication that I have personally been involved with, and it has worked beautifully well on drills and also in real situations. The person at the site, which could be the company rep as well as the HSE rep, communicates through their corresponding lines. And of course, again, I highlight the possibility of having a hotline included. On the line of the HSE, it reaches the HSE manager, who in turns communicates, in this case, to a general manager, decision maker, or for all practical purposes, his or her deputy. And then we have the line of operations until it reaches an operations manager, who as well communicates to that decision maker. It is extremely important to understand that this decision maker needs to receive 2 phone calls at minimum. In other words, it's not enough to say, well, you know, these guys talking between each other and they'll say, no, I already talked to our general manager, no need. The protocol requires for you to actually complete the cycle, just to make sure that that redundancy is in place. It is also useful maybe for these folks to have mutual communications between them. But again, the general idea is to ensure that both lines of communications do take place is the first priority above all. You can have second priorities. You can have the HSE manager, for instance, making a phone call to the regulatory area, and this person would eventually communicate agencies as required or as needed, or the general manager communicating to the board of directors, or the HSE guy communicating to the corporate HSE. Again, the idea is to have this verbal communication. And just to give you an overview, this could probably take 30, 40 minutes, 1 hour at the most. When you communicate initially, you might have some flaws on your communication in terms of, well, you know, it was not the quantity I gave you in first place. It's a different quantity, but that's not really important. The important thing is to make sure that everyone is aware and the response structure is eventually activated. That being said, let's move on to showing what an ICS structure looks like. And what I'm showing you here is the very basic structure. You can see there's an incident commander who is the undisputed maximum leader of the response, and I highlight that because I've seen some troubles in the past understanding that idea, believe it or not. Then you have the staff positions, which in this case I'm showing the information officer, which handles communications. You have the liaison officer, which handles the connections between government agencies and even with partners, business partners. You have the safety officer, which here is called safety officer, but in reality, it really handles HSE, health, safety, and environment. Then you have here 4 different sections. The operations sections, which contains essentially the technical operations team, The logistics sections, for instance, handles helicopters, vessels, even catering as required. Then you have the planning section. I won't get into the details of this because I will explain further what these folks are supposed to be doing. And then you have the financial section with its corresponding financial section chief, which keeps the emergency budget and the overall financial resources. Now, question is there any other way of structuring different from a regular or an ICS structure? And the answer is absolutely yes. And then I'm going to show you some examples I have grabbed from elsewhere. Here you have the emergency response structure that was put together by the government of Japan when they had their Fukushima nuclear accident several years ago. And this is the way they organize. I have just to say that this structure will likely work very well for them. And if they were to have a different incident, they would probably do the same. But there are several problems with this structure. Number one, there is a mix of communications with structure. So there's an overlap of those two concepts. And the most important thing that I want to point out, it is not replicable. It worked well for them. They can probably use the same structure again over and over, but it's very difficult to replicate this same structure elsewhere. Another example that I want to show you is this one here. This has to do with an actual company, the structure of a company. It's actually a mining company where they use this emergency response structure. And once again, I have no doubts that it works very well for them and they can use it and use it over and over again. But once again, it's not replicable. If you try to reproduce this elsewhere, you might run into trouble. In fact, if these folks get into an escalation of their emergency, they might have problems trying to interconnect. Something similar happened, as I said, on September 11th of 2001. So this is the major inconvenience that I see with structures that you simply try to replicate, so to speak, the typical organizational structure of the business into an emergency response. The beauty of ICS, as I mentioned, is that it gives you a reproducible, a replicable, and a standardized structure. What I'm showing here is an expanded ICS structure from a different company. This is a real ICS structure. You can read the safety officer. Well, because you have here, I'm sorry, the staff members reporting to the incident commander. You have the 4 sections that I showed you before. But I do have problems with this structure as well. It is an expanded structure, but the problem I have is that it is very complicated. 12 different substructures reporting to the incident commander is too much to handle. In an emergency, the incident commander needs to have much more room to move around and do his business, his or her business. So this structure is indeed an expanded ICS structure, but in my view, too complicated. And the major or the main highlight point that I want to make here is that you need to understand how the structure, but you also need to understand the functionality of each one of those subunits. The design needs to have the proper ICS structure, but also the proper functioning of each of its subunits. So that being said, I want to show you an example. It is, let's say it's a fictitious example, but a real example of what it would look like if we were to expand this basic structure. This is again the basic structure that I showed you before, and I'm going to show you now an expansion of this same structure, what it would look like that I believe could be functionally proper to be used in a specific or different context. Here I'm going to show you an expanded ICS structure, which in addition has the interesting point of being interconnected. To the left, we have the corporate emergency response center. In other words, this is the corporate offices located, I don't know, in Houston or Oklahoma City or elsewhere. And to the right, we have what is usually called the incident command post, which is the closest to the place where the actual incident has happened or is developing. Okay, so how would an expanded structure look like which interconnects both in this situation? This is my proposal. Again, it's fictitious, but I believe it would work perfectly well. You have, again, to the left, the folks that are located at the incident command post, and to the right, the folks that are located at corporate level. Mind you that the only purpose in life of this corporate team is to support the emergency response and the incident command post and the incident commander. Notice that I have created a new position of corporate emergency response coordinator. This is the person that receives all the information and handles the supervision of all the different subsections, and each one of them, of course, has its own leader. And to the right, we have, again, the incident commander, the staff, which is very much reduced from what I told you, simply because a lot of the staff that was here was transferred to the corporate level guys, where we have human resources, information officer, liaison officer, and legal counsel. And underneath the corporate emergency coordinator, we decided to remove the finance section and planning section and keep them at corporate levels. At the incident command post, we remain with the operation sections and the logistics sections handling the entire situation that they're facing at the war place, so to speak. Also notice that on purpose, I have replicated the liaison officer here and liaison officer here. And the reason I did that is to show you the meaning of flexibility. I told you that these structures are flexible. You can accommodate them, shrink, or expand as needed. We're showing here an expansion. But at any one time, the incident commander might make the decision of simply not needing the liaison guy or the liaison group right at the command post and just leaves the responsibility entirely to be handled by the corporate group. And as you can also imagine, as the scenario moves on, the emergency is being handled and controlled and so forth, we can expect similar expansions or shrinking as required. And since we're talking about scenarios, let's take a look at a spill scenario using the same concept of expanded and interconnection structure. Although this example that I'm going to show you refers to a spill related to an oil and gas industry, I ask those of you who are associated to other industries to please relate my example to a likely scenario that could affect your own assets. For instance, it could be a spill of milk or any other type of fluid that could eventually reach sensitive environments, like a river, for instance. Okay, so keep that in mind. This is the scenario, the structure I put here is for oil and gas, but you can also think of similar designs for your own business type of activity. So here to the right, I have again the incident command post, and to the left, the corporate structure responders. Notice that I have created a new section here, which I call source control section. And then I keep the operations section and logistics section. Why this addition of a source control section? In essence, the source control refers to a very specialized group of team in the oil and gas that handle the control of the well that where the spill comes from, okay? While the operations section will be dealing essentially with spill containment procedures and the final cleanup and so forth. It is very difficult to have everything in one single operation section. These are two completely different specialties. So it is highly recommended for the technical guys, the group that are essentially devoted to operations and technical operations, to be provided their own source control section chief, their own chief, and the operation sections to do their own dealings in relations to the spill. Again, as I said before, at any one time you could have that the source is in complete control, and the incident commander might at any one time decide to demobilize the entire source control section and just move on until the cleanup is finalized, and everything else could eventually be demobilized and reduced. To give you an idea of what that source control section looks like, again, for the case of an oil and gas business, this is essentially a possibility, having a relief well group leader, SIMOPS, which is simultaneous operations, and HSC group. In other words, the source control chief might want to have his or her own HSC group, a well engineering group as well, and even a logistics, replicating another logistics team for the source control. That's also acceptable. At any one time, the source control chief might decide to reduce its burden of sub-units and decide to transfer this IT support to the administrative support team. So I don't know, but I'm trying to do my best to explain that this is very flexible, and you can make decisions as the scenario is moves on into ideally being under a full control of the situation. Another thing that I wanted to highlight on this particular structure that I'm showing for oil and gas is the existence of another position, which is usually called the qualified individual. I won't go into the details about this, but the qualified individual is a regulatory requirement from federal agencies in the United States, and it would be the single point of contact appointed by the company in cases of a spill scenario, okay? So this is what I wanted to explain, or how I wanted to show you that an expanded structure, even interconnected structure, can look like, the design of it, that would not cause interferences, would not cause confusion. And again, we can perfectly well interconnect with other structures. If this scenario continues to complicate and escalates, we could perfectly envision this structure connecting to fire department structure, or police department structure, or county structure, and so on. Okay. Also, also ideally, they should be conforming to an ICS structure, which in the case of US, most of them are. I didn't want to leave these ideas of ICS structure without mentioning something about the physical space, because it is extremely important to design physical space where these structures are going to be located, ensuring that we're going to have spacious rooms that can accommodate all pieces of the structure. It's ideal also to have well-sized walls, good sized walls, or broad walls, so that people can place their white papers or similar information in it. We need to ensure that there be good IT facilities, computer, Wi-Fi, computer conferencing, and so forth. In the current situation of COVID-19, we know that we are mostly at home offices. And so the ideal thing is to make sure that there's adequate video teleconferencing systems and connectivity and communication, which IT groups, of course, are very ingenious at doing a good job at it. So this is where I wanted to stop in terms of talking about structure. And the next thing I want to show you is just dig into pandemics and epidemics. And the way I decided to do this, again, with the idea of simplifying the theoretical concepts, is by using a system dynamics model, which I grabbed from the MIT website. Here, this is a model which shows you what a pandemic and epidemic looks like and how it behaves, so to speak. This model refers to the SARS pandemics that took place in 2002, 2004, but for all practical purposes, you could perfectly well substitute SARS by COVID-19 or any other type of infection, which is going to work very well. In fact, SARS was also a coronavirus, as COVID-19 is. Main thing I want to highlight on this model is the three most important variables that we see here. The susceptible portion of the population, that is actually coming from the total population, that is in terms being affected by direct contact with people that are infected, or between infected people or uninfected people, and so on, all kinds of possible, all kinds of possibilities. Then we have this other variable, which is the portion of the population, of the susceptible population that is infected. And finally, we have ideally the group of population, group of people that have recovered from the infection. All of these different variables are affected, or are one way or the other affected by the infection rate or the recovery rate or whatever other thing we want to include in this model. Nice thing about these models, as with any other models, we can complicate it as much as we want, or we can leave it as simple as much as we want. We could imagine, for instance, to have on this recovery rate the ideal thing that we're all looking for of a treatment for COVID-19, and then how treatment affects one way or the other that recovery rate. So I like these system dynamics models because they allow you to see in a single shot the complexity of how things developed, and without making it very complicated. And again, you can then work on these models and include other variables, other parameters. I don't want to go into more details about this model. I just wanted to show you this is what a pandemic or epidemic look like in terms of a systems dynamic model that I'm trying to show here. So let's talk about a case study, the swine flu pandemic, which took place in 2009 and 2010. The reason I want to bring it up here is because I was working for a company when this happened, and I had to activate myself and be part of the management team that handled this situation. The swine flu, also called the H1n1 pandemic, had its initiation in Veracruz, Mexico, in January 2009, and the pandemic reached its closing on August 2010. There were 1.6 million confirmed cases, 18,000 confirmed deaths, and an estimated 150 to perhaps 500,000 people, according to the World Health Organization and the CDC in the US. So it was a very severe situation. And I'm going to show you next how the World Health Organization visualizes pandemics. They essentially define six different phases from the early stages of 1 and 2, phases 1 and 2, which mostly shows animal infection transmissions. Phase 4, where there is evidence of a sustained human-to-human transmission. And then you finally reach a phase 4, 6 and 5 pandemic level, where there is a widespread infection. And that is usually then referred to as a pandemic, which is the case that we're living in, we're going through with COVID-19. In the case of the H1n1 pandemic, there was news that something was going on already in January 2009. And then as we move along, the World Health Organization declared a pandemic in June of 2009. As I said before, it ended up in August 2010. So this was the H1n1 pandemic. And when we at the company knew about the situation, somewhere around here, we had several meetings at corporate level, and we made the decision that we needed to activate our ICS structure. But the very important decision that we made was that we were only to activate the basic ICS structure. So this is what we did when we had to face the H1n1 pandemic, and then we'll get into the details of how the structure functions, because I would like to show it to you after or in reference to COVID-19. So with no further ado, we will get into COVID-19 pandemic. This is, again, the different phases according to WHO. As you know, we got to know about something that was going on in China in December 1st, 2019. Phase 4 was declared somewhere around April 27th, and as we all know, it became a pandemic or it was declared a pandemic by WHO on March 11th. We don't know when the peak is going to arise. We know that there are different countries at different stages of these phases. And we, of course, have no idea of when this post-pandemic phase is going to be activated. What to do in this case? Same recommendation that was made in regards to the H1n1 situation. It is highly recommended to activate the emergency response structure, but try to make it simple and keep as much as possible a basic structure for attending the needs of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, let's explain what the dynamics would be like for this basic structure as the COVID-19 is in play. And to do that, I'm going to show you this unidimensional matrix where we have here the names of each one of the structure pieces that I showed you before. In the first column, we're going to see the full emergency response team in play. The second column would be for the operation section, the other one for safety officer, logistics, human resources, information officer. The planning section, which I told you I was going to be a little more detailed on what they do. Finance section, liaison, and also I have included here a column for the other departments. When I mean other departments, I mean the rest of the organization that not necessarily are part of the emergency response team, but they do have a lot of responsibilities at informing, for instance, human resources on the whereabouts of their own personnel, okay? So what is it that these guys are gonna be doing on a typical phase 6 pandemic situation like the one we're living right now with COVID-19? This is partially a fictitious proposal, but I think you will relate to it very well. You can, of course, change this as necessary, as needed on your own current situation at your companies. At the level of the ICS emergency response team, it's highly recommended for the entire team to have daily meetings. And in that daily meeting, they should be reviewing the reports of each one of the other sections and have a follow-up on the business continuity strategies that are essentially supposed to be presented by the planning section. At the operations section, they should be following up on the preventive medical evaluations for the operating personnel, following, of course, CDC recommendations or WHO. Personnel suspected of being contagious should be excluded from the operations until confirmation to the contrary. And of course, all of this applies to contract personnel, rotating personnel, and any other person of the staff alike. They can also, for instance, and all facilities, prepares and executes communications to employees about the entrance related to measures in the facilities, provides technical support as necessary to keep clean teams at a distance. The human resource officer plays a very, very critical role. He has to keep track of the absenteeism, although we are, of course, at home offices. It needs to get the reports from other departments in terms of how their personnel, the entire personnel is doing, activates the work contingency plan if there's any, maintains the communication strategy along with the safety officer and of course the information officer. The information officer, as I said, deals with communications, so it needs to keep track of communications pertaining to decision-making related to the emergency or to the crisis situation we're living in. Remember that COVID-19, we cannot really envision it as an emergency, but it is a crisis situation. The planning section is, in my view, the least understood of all portions of the ICS structure. In general, people believe that the purpose of the planning section is to collect the forms, to keep documentations of ICS in place and in good shape and so on. And that is partially true, or it's one of their major roles is to do that. But the most important role of the planning section is to think of tomorrow. Planning section should continuously be reviewing the business plan and think of what we should be doing next. For instance, if we are right now at the pandemic level, on a phase 6, the planning section should start building the strategy of what the post-pandemic stage will look like. For instance, how is it that we're going to have the return to the offices of people? Are we going to do it by age classes? As we know, the older guys are more susceptible, so should we do it that way? Should we do it different ways? And I know you have received tons of information related to that. The good thing about the planning section also is that right now we're receiving so much information from all different places that helps on putting together the plan for tomorrow. But again, bottom line, the highlight I want to make is the planning section is to be thinking on tomorrow, continuously monitoring the situation and run the risk analysis, the risk-based analysis to provide information to the emergency response team as how we're going to handle the next phase or the next requirements and so on. Finance section, I already told you, that's essentially keep track of budget and resources. Liaison officer, continuously monitoring the information coming from government agencies and keeping our business partners well informed of what we're doing. Other departments should be continuously reporting to HR about the critical personnel needs, comply with the decision of the ICS team and board of directors, and maintain an active monitoring on the health of their personnel who are reporting their status to human resources. So this is what I wanted to show you, what I wanted to explain in relation to how to handle this situation of COVID-19. I know, and I again insist, this is not an emergency, but there are multiple benefits of using this structure while keeping track of COVID-19. It provides a very systemic way of doing things, following proper emergency procedures and protocols. It puts everybody into an emergency mindset, so to speak, which is much different from the business as usual mindset. Things are very, very different in terms of timing, priorities, and the usual set of conditions. You don't do things the same way on a business as usual mindset as when you are into an emergency mindset. And this is one of the many benefits. People will be already in that emergency mindset for attending the needs of this crisis situation. People on this emergency structure, on ICS emergency structure, are generally trained on this organizational setup, and therefore it should not cause an impact to transition into the workings of an emergency-like scenario. And a very important thing is, in the event there is a real emergency at this moment, because the ICS structure is already in place and functioning accordingly, there should be an increased effectiveness when attending the actual emergency that might arise. Let's suppose that at this moment, when we're just organized on keeping track to COVID-19, there is a spill, like we mentioned before. The operations sections will immediately activate their structure, and there'll be the same daily meetings, or perhaps more than one daily meeting and so on, where the operations section will obviously be reporting and communicating how things are being done, and the rest of the sections and structures should be supporting 100% the emergency situation that has arisen. But the bottom line that I want to make is there is tremendous advantage of having the configuration of an ICS structure already in place, because it really puts us into this, like I said, emergency response mindset. That being said, I want to have a very quick highlights of the things we talked about. Pandemic and pandemic scenarios. In the cases of pandemic or epidemic or pandemic scenarios, it is very convenient to maintain an ICS type of organizational structure. It really reduces confusion. Just imagine putting together different structures for each scenario. It doesn't make any sense. What you have to do is be flexible, increase, reduce as needed your structure. The tremendous advantage of having a standardized structure which facilitates interconnection with other entities. Once again, the structural flexibility that this ICS structure has, providing coherence and functionality to the different portions of it. Initial notifications, I said, ideally must maintain redundancy. Don't use a single line of communication, is not helpful. The importance of differentiating between business hierarchy and business emergency structure. I said something about it. It's extremely important. You don't do the same on business as usual as you do when you are on an emergency structure. I also highlighted the importance of understanding that the incident commander is the highest undisputed authority in the structure. And it's ideal to have a single line of communications on each one of the different subunits, or else it can also be confusing. The physical space for sustaining the entire ICS structure, I talked about it, I think, at length. These physical space should be well organized, should have spaces even exclusive for each one of the ICS activities. Each group team should be well identified. Each member must be provided with an identity badge or a distinctive vests, ideally. I also talk about the importance, or I don't know if I made enough emphasis on the importance of being well trained. Everyone must have reasonable knowledge of everyone else's functions within the ICS structure. It's extremely important to exercise, to drill, because drilling allows us to evaluate and recognize things that we need to correct, lessons learned, and execute, of course, those corrective actions, and of course, improve our capabilities for responding to an emergency. And last but not least, keep in mind that you need to have those emergency procedures very well updated at all times. That being said, I want to transfer over again to David for the quality for questions and answers section, David.
Jorge, thank you so much for that great overview of ICS and how it can relate to the current pandemic. And as I look across the list of participants, I also see, some of our partner organizations in the Petroleum Alliance and SOAR and OERB, and we'd like to thank you for your attendance, as well as everyone's attendance and engagement. We've had several questions submitted, Jorge. Okay. We'll have time to address a few of those. And might start with one, how often, you just talked about training and drilling and these kinds of things. How often do you recommend that people conduct an ICS practice and training session, and what percentage of the organization should be trained on ICS?
Well, to begin with, once you have a design structure, it's critical to, of course, assign folks from the organization to that ICS structure. And the folks that need to be trained essentially are the ones belonging to the ICS structure. The frequency, in some cases, there are government requirements to the frequency of training. In the United States, there is a requirement to have at least one drill. In the oil and gas industry, there is a requirement to have at least one drill. In the case of the offshore operations, I don't know much about onshore in this regards, but you have to have, there's always a link with regulatory requirements. Now, how often then the training should go also is ideally to have at least one or twice some theoretical training taking place, and ideally also to have, as soon as you have that theoretical training done, is really good to, of course, dig into and get into a drill, an exercise. Best way to train, no doubt, is to have drills. You can know a lot about ICS, you can know a lot about structure and how it functions, but the only way you're going to know how it really happens is at minimum to have a drill. And of course, if a real situation happens, a real emergency, no doubt, you're going to learn no matter what.
Sure. No, that's terrific. I think we have time for probably 3 more questions, Jorge. And I might jump to this one. You covered it just very, very briefly, the qualified individual. Okay. Is the qualified individual part of the ICS structure, or is it outside the structure? I know you kind of jumped through that quickly. What's your kind of brief response to that?
Yes. If you were to ask the typical trainer on ICS, they will tell you that, well, no, the qualified individual is not part of the ICS structure. In fact, if you take FEMA courses on ICS, and they're available courses through FEMA, you won't find any mentioning of the qualified individual. But having been one of those qualified individuals, I tell you, I don't know how anyone could say that a qualified individual is not part of the structure. There's tremendous pressure on the qualified individual. The qualified individual needs to begin with to fully understand the structure, know every one single piece of how that structure works, is completely engaged on all briefings provided by the incident commander, is the one providing the needs that the incident commander demands. So qualified individual, I was formally speaking, is not part of the emergency response structure, but in my particular opinion, that's a little bit absurd. Because once the qualified individual is there, and that is once there is a spill and there's the need to have a qualified individual per regulatory requirements, that guy or that person is going to be playing very, very active, a very, very active role within the structure, no matter what.
No, that's great, and thank you for that perspective. This one, there's two final questions, and they're somewhat related. I'll start with the larger kind of overarching question, and then a more specific one. This question is, what are the main organizational features required for ICS? You covered it generally, so just in a few short thoughts on what are the main organizational features required for ICS to be implemented and successful.
You said the main what again?
The main organizational features.
Yeah. Well, in essence, if we were just to make generalizations, you need to have an incident command. You need to have somebody in command of the structure. You need to have a staff group member reporting to the incident commander, and it's critical to have at minimum those 4 basic sections that I mentioned to you. But another thing that is critical in terms of organizational structure is to understand that specific structure you have designed for your company will likely link to the possibility of a government organizational structure, which of course ideally will be also structured as an ICS itself. So you can have a command structure that extends to government agencies in the offshore business. For instance, you can have Coast Guard included and so on. So the critical point though is, again, making sure that every one of those boxes are very well designed, very well interpreted to the point of allowing expanding or shrinking as needed.
No, that's very, very helpful, Jorge. And this last question, is a combination of several. So how do you determine, you hit on some of this briefly, but how do you determine who should be the incident commander? And then more broadly, how do you determine which person is in which role?
Okay, good. We can make a very extensive list of desirable tenets that the incident commander must have. But in short, I would say that number one, the incident commander needs to have an overall leadership qualities. And of course, that also applies to every one of those chiefs or section heads and so on that I explained for each one of those subsections of the ICS. The incident commander has to have a very strong knowledge and experience on emergency response management, which would include formal training, obviously including ICS, participation in actual emergency response situations, as well as drill and exercises and so on. That person should also have demonstrated capabilities to perform under highly stressful conditions. We all know, anyone who's been on an emergency knows that it's no joke, it's not business as usual, it's very stressful. The person needs to have a reasonable knowledge of his or her emergency response team members, and ideally must have had previous roles as deputy incident commander. If that has happened, it really helps to do a good job at this position. In other words, a person who has had incremental experience and exposure at navigating through the complexity of responding to various scenarios of emergency situations. And if I recall, the second part of your question had to do, what about the other team members? I would say the other team members, many of the things that I just mentioned needs also to be in place. They all have to have training, proper training, enough training to be part of that ICS structure. And the way you choose every one of them, in a way, I would say you could perfectly well relate each member to each position according to what they usually do on their business as usual position. For instance, if you want to conform the planning section, I would highly recommend to look for the guys into the planning department. It is very important to understand that the planning department is doing planning, business planning, so they do have to have training before becoming an ICS within the ICS planning section. So it's not exactly, they don't do exactly the same thing they were doing, but they do have the planning mindset to be part of that particular section. I'm going to give you a second example. You know, who should be the ones involved in the operations section? And it's obviously those guys that have the technical operational expertise. They are the ones who should be forming part of that section. And of course, the operations section chief, it could perfectly well be one of the managers or the manager of the operations activities, operational activities.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Jorge, for a great overview of ICS and in a wonderful webinar today. Thank you all for your attendance. This will conclude our webinar today, and we really appreciate your attendance, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.